Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special installment of our bi-monthly Transportation Performance Management webinar series, sponsored by the TPM Pooled Fund with support from the Committee on Performance-Based Management and Federal Highway. This is Christos Xenofondos, Assistant Director at the Rhode Island Department of Transportation and TPM Pooled Fund Lead, as well as the Vice Chair of AASHTO's Committee on Performance-Based Management. It is really great to see such an impressive number of attendees to our webinar today, and I am sure that it has something to do with the outstanding group of agency leaders from across the U.S. that we have assembled for you today. Joining us today, our Federal Highways Acting Administrator, Stephanie Pollack, and old neighbor to Rhode Island, Caltrans Director, Tox Omishakin, Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development Secretary, Sean Wilson, Minnesota DOT Commissioner Margaret Anderson Kelleher, and Secretary Roger Millar from Washington State DOT. On behalf of both the TPM Pooled Fund and AASHTO's Committee on Performance-Based Management, a warm welcome to our special guests and a big thank you to all of them for accepting our invitation to be here with us today. This group represents some of the great leadership we have in the country to move transportation forward, and I look forward to hearing their insights on emerging themes, strategies, and policies for transportation performance management. For more information on this webinar series, just visit the TPM portal at www.tpm-portal.com and click on TPM Webinar Series under Events in the main menu. The TPM portal is where the TPM community can find the latest documents, videos, tools, trainings, and events, and it should be on top of your bookmark list. You can access the presentations for today's webinar at the bottom of the webinar panel on your screen. Links to video and slides from today's webinar and archived content from previous webinars will also be posted on the AASHTO.TPM portal site. As we start the webinar, all attendees are muted. If you have questions for the presenters during today's webinar, please use the Q&A feature on your webinar control panel. Our presenters will answer your questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. None of this would have been possible without the strong partnership between AASHTO, Federal Highway, and the states that we were able to build as a result of the work from our staff liaison at AASHTO, Matt Harty, our federal partners at the Federal Highway Office of Performance Management, Peter Stefanos and Susanna Reck, and the leadership of the Committee on Performance-Based Management. With that, I will turn it over to Susanna Reck, the Federal Highways Transportation Performance Management Lead, and a great partner to the state DOTs, for a welcome on behalf of Federal Highway. Susanna?
Thanks, Christos. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Loud and clear.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Christos. As Christos said, I'm Susanna Reck. I'm the TPM team lead from Federal Highways, and I'd like to thank Acting Administrator Stephanie Pollack for her participation in today's webinar, and especially for sharing the Biden administration's vision for TPM. Hello? Hello?
You're good, Susanna.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was getting a lot of feedback, so I just wanted to make sure it wasn't me. I also want to thank our esteemed group of state DOT CEOs who will be sharing their thoughts on the future of TPM. And I'm personally looking forward to hearing about their thoughts on performance management as it relates to issues such as equity, economic vitality, active transportation, and public health. We're so thrilled that so many people are here with us today. I think it's a testament to the interest in our topics as well as our esteemed panel members. I also want to acknowledge the partnership, similar to what Christo mentioned, the partnership that exists between Federal Highways, AASHTO, and the TPM Pooled Fund members. It's by working together through this pooled fund that we're able to host webinars like the one we're hosting today. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Matt Harty, who will give the welcome on behalf of AASHTO. Thank you, everyone, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right, thanks, Susanna. I won't take up too much time. So I'm Matt Hardy, Program Director for Planning and Performance Management here at AASHTO. Welcome on behalf of AASHTO. As Susanna mentioned, this Transportation Performance Management webinar series is a collaboration, I think a great collaboration among FHWA, AASHTO, and the TPM Pooled Fund. Because of this partnership, we are able to support the broad TPM community in sharing new ideas and building capacity on the topics of greatest interest to all of you. I do want to highlight that this was sponsored in part by the TPM Pooled Fund, and at the AASHTO Board of Directors meeting last week, a new TPM technical service program that will replace the Pooled Fund program was approved. So thank you to the CEOs here today for approving that, so that we'll be able to continue the great work of the TPM Pooled Fund through the TSP. So if you're from a state DOT, look for more information about that in the months ahead. Our webinar today will highlight some of the important work going on around the country at the national level, at the cutting edge of defining the future of performance management. I also want to mention that we'd like to continue this dialogue. In fact, today's event will provide the context and framing for further discussion of potential new performance measures and new performance management processes, frameworks, etc. during the next joint AASHTO Committee on Performance-Based Management TPM Pooled Fund quarterly meeting scheduled for Thursday, June 17th, 2021. I also want to take a couple seconds to thank the great team at Spy Pond Partners, led by Hyana Park, Lori Richter, Perry Lubin are the ones that have been most active on this one. Thank you to your team, Hyana, for the great work that you do to support the TPM Pooled Fund. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Hyana Park from Spy Pond Partners to share our agenda for today's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for that compliment. First of all, first up on our agenda today, we'll have Acting Administrator Stephanie Pollock from the Federal Highways, who will provide the Biden-Harris administration's vision with respect to transportation performance management. Then Director Tox Amishakan will talk about emerging performance management topics at the California Department of Transportation. Next, we'll hear from Secretary Sean Wilson of the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, who will present the future of performance management in Louisiana. Commissioner Margaret Anderson Kelleher from the Minnesota Department of Transportation will talk about how her agency is using performance measures to drive progressive policies. And Secretary Roger Millar from the Washington State Department of Transportation will wrap up our presentations focusing on the value of equity in transportation. So now let's get started with our presentations. Stephanie Pollock was named Acting Federal Highway Administrator on February 24th, 2021. In this role, she provides executive leadership and strategic direction within federal highways to advance the goals and priorities of the department. She brings over 30 years of executive experience to the agency and most recently served as Secretary and CEO of the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. I first met Stephanie when we were undergrads in the same dorm at MIT. She's been an innovator in every endeavor she's taken on since then. I'm looking forward to how she'll lead FHWA in the coming years for the benefit of our national transportation system. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie Pollock.
Thank you, Hyana, and it's great to see you. Can everybody hear me and see the slides? Okay. All right. So thank you for this opportunity and for putting together such an amazing panel, and also for the collaboration that has been going on for some time with AASHTO and Federal Highway and what was the TPM Pooled Fund. And we really look forward to continuing that collaboration, because as all of us are going to be talking about today, transportation performance management is really important, and we're really still fairly early in the journey, and we have a lot to learn from each other. So I want to start with some basics, even though I think most of the people on this webinar know them. And the reason is because I went back to take a look at the basics from the Federal Highway side after I left my position on the Massachusetts state side, to kind of remind myself of what Congress was trying to accomplish first in MAP 21 and then in the FAST Act when it established the Transportation Performance Management System. And you know, it's really interesting because it was very ambitious. What they were trying to do, they were trying to, the language that they actually used was to transform the federal aid highway program. You know, when we read section 150, which is the statutory basis for this work, we tend to start with the, you know, paragraph B, which sort of lists the actual goals that we all have to follow, or C, which are the rules of the road. But it's really important for us to go back to, you know, first principles, which is we are trying to transform the federal aid highway system. And then there are 4 specific policies that are listed in that statement of policy. And that is provide efficient investment, refocus on our national transportation goals, increase accountability and transparency, and improve decision-making through performance-based planning. And I want to talk for a minute about one of those, which is accountability. And I want to focus on that because as a former state CEO and with 4 really great CEOs on our panel, we talk a lot when we talk about the federal aid highway program. We talk a lot about flexibility. Sorry, I am having technical problems, but hopefully you're all still seeing my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen.
So
we've lost the screen, Stephanie. Oh, now
all right,
it's back.
Hang on.
Now it's back.
All right. So the federal aid highway program is 92% formula funds and 8% discretionary grants like infra and build. And that definitely helps states with flexibility. But it may not be as effective a method of achieving accountability because we're basically pushing $47 billion out the door every year and counting on the states to spend it on the things that will bend the curves that we are trying to bend. So to me, flexibility and accountability are, as shown in this picture, 2 sides of the same coin. And we need to get, if we can get accountability right through transportation performance management, then we continue to provide states with the flexibility that they're looking for in the federal aid highway program. So next are the 7 goals. And again, it's important because I think once a federal highway put out its rulemaking on these, everybody immediately focused on the areas in which there needs to be target setting. But one of my messages for today, and as we talk about the future of the program, is we have not yet created a comprehensive transportation performance management system that will actually achieve all 7 of the goals that have been laid out by Congress because we don't have targets that push us towards all 7 of these goals. We have targets for some of them, but not targets for all of them. And as I will talk about, we're not actually hitting our targets in the case of many states for all of them. So we both need to think about, have we set the right targets? Are we setting them the right way? And what do we do when we're not making those targets if we're serious about transportation performance management? So as Federal Highway took the congressional language that was initially in MAP 21 in the FAST Act and turned it into a rulemaking, we focused on 4 of our existing programs: the Highway Safety Improvement Program to help us define the safety goal, the National Highway Performance Program, which is the basis for our pavement and bridge condition goals, the National Highway Freight Program, which is the basis for the freight reliability goal, and the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program, which is the basis for the congestion and emissions goals. And, you know, the other thing that's important to sort of think about as we think about the future of this important program is that different entities play a different role in putting the pieces together so that we have a comprehensive approach to transportation performance management. Congress, of course, set those national goals. Then Federal Highway, through rulemaking, laid out the 6 measures that we are expecting the states to focus on. The state DOTs actually set their targets. So if we have a metric for bridge condition or safety, there has to be a state target, but the target is actually set by the state. And federal highway, while we work with the states, does not actually have approval authority over those targets that are set by the states. And then there's the process of getting from having a target to actually achieving the goals and creating the accountability and transparency that Congress called for. And that involves planning work and reporting work on the part of the states, again, with the collaboration and the stewardship oversight of federal highway. But a lot of this does fall on the states, as I'm sure the 4 CEOs who follow me are going to talk about. So federal highway did finalize a final rule on different metrics. This slide talks about the infrastructure metrics, so bridge condition and pavement condition. It changed the pavement condition measure. It set out a 4-year performance period with a 2-year progress review, set out rules for asset management plans, minimum conditions. So infrastructure, you would think, would be one of the most straightforward places. But I'll talk about performance on infrastructure in a minute. The next thing that I do want to touch on, though, before I turn to that is, so what happens if a state sets transportation performance management targets and doesn't meet them? And the answer is, it depends on what Congress said what happens, because it's not ultimately up to federal highway or US DOT. So for example, if you miss a safety goal, there is a consequence written into law, which is, and the consequence really for all of these is the same, which is you lose some of that flexibility, that funding flexibility that you get with formula programs, reinforcing my notion that we need to see flexibility and accountability as 2 sides of the same coin. If you're not accountable for the targets you've set in certain areas, the consequence that Congress has laid out is not to take money away from you, it's not to punish you, but it is to say, then we're going to reduce your funding flexibility because we want you to make investments in that area where you're not meeting your target. So in the case of safety, for example, you lose some flexibility in terms of being able to reprogram HSIP money. And you have to, in your strategic highway safety plan, you have to sort of lay out how you're going to spend all your HSIP safety money. Similarly, if you don't make significant progress on the condition goals for bridges and pavements, you lose some funding flexibility and you have to reallocate money. So the system is really designed to give states a lot of flexibility to set your targets and to use your federal aid dollars. And the consequence after a couple of years, if you're missing those targets, is to sort of say, you're clearly not investing enough money in meeting those targets. You need to take the money you already have, you don't get extra money, and direct it towards those targets. So that brings us to the question, well, how are the states doing? In some cases, we have 1 year of data. And in some cases, we're approaching that 2 years of data. So for system performance, CMAQ, and freight, there were really 6 measures. Reliability for trucks, system reliability, hours of excessive delay, non-SOV travel, which the 2 with asterisks are limited to bigger metropolitan areas with 1 million or more, and emissions. And there is a process for a state and MPO target setting, and then there is a 2-year review of the data that will be done by federal highway. So this is actually, I think, just the year 1 data. And, you know, to me, this is a sort of good news, bad news story. For non-interstate NHS pavement, for example, 47 of the states made significant progress, and that's really great. And of those 47, 42, so there's 2 ways to make significant progress. One way is you actually achieve the target you set, and the other way is you make what's called significant progress towards achieving that target. And in this case, 42 states actually achieved the targets that they set. And so that is great news. For bridges, it's not quite as strong, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment. We had 39 states, for example, met their targets for the percentage of bridges that would be in poor condition. Only 30% met their target for the percentage of bridges in good condition. So I actually want to talk about bridges for one moment before we turn to the safety targets, because I think it's an example of the importance of defining what you're doing correctly and of setting your targets correctly in transportation performance measurement. You know, an acquaintance of mine who was a big city DPW director told me his first experience with transportation performance management was when the mayor set a goal of getting a certain percentage of potholes filled in the first 24 hours after they were reported to the DPW. And at first he was delighted because they were hitting that target 95% of the time, and he thought, this is great. Then he found out that the guys were not reporting potholes until they were ready to fill them, so that they could report that all the potholes were being filled within 24 hours of being reported. So they weren't accelerating pothole repair, right? They were slowing down reporting. It achieved the target. That is an example of not setting a target in a format that actually accomplishes what we're trying to accomplish, which is why I say we have to keep going back to those goals that Congress asked, and not just ask the question, are we meeting the targets that we set in the rulemaking, but are we achieving the goals that Congress set out for us? So bridges is an area that I've been thinking a lot as we've been working with the White House and Congress on putting together the American Jobs Plan. And based on the percentage of states who are doing okay on their bridge targets, you would think that we're doing really well on bridge condition in the United States, but we're not really. This chart, which is based on data from our national bridge inventory, but put together by the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, shows that there's been a very modest decrease in the number of structurally deficient bridges in poor condition from around 48,000 to around $45,000. And I would note that of the 45 billion plus in annual FAST Act authorization, about 7 billion is being spent on bridges. So honestly, getting 1,000 fewer poor condition bridges a year when you're spending $7 billion a year is not necessarily a sign that we're making progress at the rate we should be making progress. But when you look under the hood of these numbers, the situation gets even more concerning. So the target, the goal that's been set in the federal highway rulemaking, and remember I was not administrator, acting administrator when that was set, focuses on bridges that are part of the national highway system, not so-called off-system bridges, which are not on the NHS. So what we've actually done is push down the number of on-system bridges in poor condition to about 15,000, and we now have 30,000 off-system bridges in poor condition that we don't count when we do the state targets. And so actually what's happening is the proportion of poor condition bridges that are off-system bridges are going up, and states are spending most of their money on system bridges, even though 2 out of 3 of their poor condition bridges are off the system. In addition, while we're doing okay on poor condition bridges, we're actually seeing the percentage of bridges in good condition dip modestly, and fair condition bridges are also either steady or down, because there seems to be an incentive in the way we built the metric to sort of go after the poor condition bridges and not do what might be more cost-effective bridge preservation work that would prevent a currently fair or even good, but mostly fair condition bridge from falling into poor condition. So if our transportation performance management system for bridges, right, is just enriching the proportion of off-system bridges that are in bad shape and incentivizing work on poor condition bridges, but not on preservation on fair condition bridges, it may be that we need to make adjustments to that system if we really want to ensure that we're making the right investment in bridges under the transportation performance management system. So that's one example I wanted to put out there to sort of provoke some thought and conversation about how can we do better, because that's really the question for this webinar. It's not that folks haven't been hard at work at this. We always have to ask ourselves how can we do better. Safety is another area where I think we need to ask ourselves, how can we do better? So to sort of cut to the chase on safety, we're seeing a lot of states missing their targets. In 2018, 19 states missed targets, and actually the majority of states did not make progress over the 2-year assessment period. They either missed the targets and did not, or if they, they either failed to meet the targets and failed to make significant progress. And we also, the serious injury targets were not met, and the non-motorized targets were not met. And, you know, safety is another example of where, you know, some of the pushback that I get when I talk about this with states is, well, we're not in control. We don't really control the enforcement part. We don't control how fast people drive. And that's true. But we do need to lever what we do control. And we do control speed limit setting. And we do control the design speeds of the projects we build. And we do control whether we're building separated bike facilities in order to protect non-motorized folks and help meet those targets. So we don't control everything about safety, but we do control some things. And I hope that the reaction to the problems that states are encountering, and remember, the states set these targets, they don't even need to be declining targets, they're not approved by federal highway, and yet states are not meeting them. So where I want to end and turn it over to my state CEOs, who I look forward to listening to, is how do we take transportation management, performance management to the next level? So if we go back to those 7 national goals, right? Significant reduction in traffic fatalities and serious injuries, highway infrastructure that's in a state of good repair, a system that's reliable, a system that involves a significant reduction in congestion, a system that strengthens the ability of rural communities to access national trade. We're not there. That doesn't mean we're not trending in the right direction on some of those, but we certainly have not achieved those 7 national goals. So we have to ask ourselves, you know, do we have all the pieces in place to succeed in transportation performance management? And what I would say is we have a tendency in the transportation world to mix up inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And inputs, you know, we tend to, before we had TPM, we actually measured success by inputs. It was just dollars in projects. That's what we counted. We've made progress. At least we're now looking at other inputs like asset management condition, and in the safety field, laws have become inputs. But a lot of the targets and measures that have been put together since MAP 21 are actually measuring outputs, right? Improved bridge conditions, improved pavement conditions, maybe even lower emissions, but not outcomes. Because an outcome is my travel more reliable? Are rural communities better connected to the national freight system? Is transportation contributing to a healthier and more sustainable environment? Those are the outcomes. And so I would end by saying, you know, that we need to expand our toolkit under transportation performance management. And we need to continue to think about inputs and outputs and even outcomes, but we also have to go beyond outcomes and think about impacts, because the task that was set to us by Congress was to transform the federal aid highway system, and therefore system change. And so if the goals and measures that we're working with under the statutes are really about, let's assume they're mostly about outcomes, yes, we have to look to our left, look downstream, and ask, are we directing our inputs and measuring our outputs to achieve those outcomes? But we also have to look upstream, and we have to start with the kind of system change we want. And I know that's what some of the CEOs are going to talk about in terms of equity, in terms of climate change, in terms of system reliability. And we have to start with those system changes and back into the question of, are we even measuring the right outcomes before we ask ourselves how to change our inputs and outputs to achieve true transformational change in the federal aid highway system and the kind of accountability that Congress called for. So thanks for listening, and I'm going to turn it back over to Una.
Thank you, Administrator Pollack. That was great. So remember, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A panel, and we'll address them during the Q&A session after the presentation. For our next speaker, we'll hear from Tox Omishakin from the California Department of Transportation. Director Omishakin was appointed director by Caltrans, of Caltrans by Governor Newsom in 2019. He manages a $15 billion budget and nearly 21,000 employees who oversee 50,000 lane miles of highways, maintain 13,000 bridges, permit more than 400 public use airports, fund 3 of Amtrak's busiest intercity rail services, and support more than 200 transit agencies. Previously, he spent 8 years as Deputy Commissioner with the Tennessee Department of Transportation and served in the Nashville Mayor's Office. He is chair of the Active Transportation Council for the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials and is a America Walks board member. Please join me in welcoming Director Amishakan.
Thank you, Hiona. Can you hear me? Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
good.
very clearly.
Good. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the support of this webinar series and your continued leadership and partnership in transportation. Thank you to all the sponsors, and in particular, thank you to AASHTO for continuing to put on this webinar series and inviting Caltrans to be a part of this sixth webinar. And also thank you to Acting Administrator Stephanie Pollock for her leadership and her work to move us along as a nation on this very, very important issue. I think she did a very good job there of laying out sort of where we are as a nation. But when you think about where we are as a country, as a nation, I can't think of a more exciting time for us to be doing the work that we're doing. I call this moment a moment of a great pivot. We're in the midst of a great pivot where you have clearly a convergence of issues around policy, new policy ideas and direction, and resources unlike we've ever had before, coming together to help us go down the path in a direction that we believe we should be headed as a nation. So it's a very exciting time and a very appropriate time and opportune time to be talking about TPM and how TPM ties into this overall direction that we're headed in. Because the 7 goals that Stephanie laid out there pretty well, I think they're commendable. We've been doing a lot of work on them at Caltrans, both with our MPOs and with our transit agencies. But there's a lot happening in this space. The TPM, as she mentioned, is nearly 10 years old. I think MAP 21 passed in 2011 or 2012. A lot happens in a decade. A lot happens in a decade in the transportation space, and a lot can happen almost in a year. We completely live almost in a different world just in comparison to where we were last year to this year. And though it takes often 10 years or 12 years sometimes to deliver a transportation project, we need to be open to evolving. And I'm glad the leadership at Federal Highways, FTA, and my DOT peers that I have a lot of respect for that are on here are open to us making these shifts as well. So next slide. So one of the most important areas I believe we need to start thinking about making these adjustments is on the front of equity. And I know my peers, my partners are going to touch on this in a little bit more detail probably than I am, but it's very exciting to see that the Biden administration is already sort of leading the way on this. We in California at Caltrans, we completely believe, we have taken the lead on this, that this is one of the most important policy shifts and policy ideas that we will make in the department. We're putting resources to this. We've created a brand new division, a completely new division that's working on this. We put out an equity statement that addresses the issue of equity, but we also created a framework that will guide our decision making, and we're putting measures behind this that will hopefully align with some of the direction that the federal government is going as well. It's good to see the signals from the federal government around issues like the new RAISE program that's come out and infra, highlighting the fact that we need to do more for underserved communities. But let me just briefly explain the framework. And not all of this is directly related to the system itself, if you will, but very much equity as a policy issue for a DOT, for any DOT, for any state DOT or city DOT, as a matter of fact. Number one, our people. We believe we should have a workforce that reflects the people we serve. California is a very diverse state, but when you go to the varying levels of staffing within our department, we think we can do better at the rank and file level, entry level, all the way up to the senior executive level of staffing within the department. Hiring, promoting, training, all those opportunities we think should be open to people regardless of ethnicity, creed, orientation. This is a key issue. If we're going to deliver a system that is truly uplifting and better for the communities we serve, we think the workforce that does that work should also reflect that. Next, projects and programs. This is where I think a lot of growth has happened for us, all of us in transportation in the recent years, in the recent months, is we've increased our understanding of the impact of the work that we do, the work that we've planned and designed and built for many years. We understand more than ever that not only did it do a lot to provide key connectivity, it did a lot for economic growth and commerce, but it also had a lot of harmful impacts as well. And I think we're finally being as honest as we can be about this issue and saying, moving forward, we can't afford to do that again. That projects that we do, the programs that we engage in should provide uplift to all communities, including communities that have been marginalized or underserved for many years. That's what we're committing to with this particular P. The third P, partnerships. We have a robust budget related to small business and DBEs at Caltrans in California. Last year, we spent a little over $1 billion, $1.1 billion on small business and DBE in our department. But when you look at the data a little bit more closely, it's increasingly not the communities that we believe should be having the opportunity. A lot of Latino, Hispanic, African American communities are falling short in some of the disparity goals that we've set. And so we believe we can do more here and create partnerships with private companies as well, and community groups and organizations, and engage like we never have before as we look to move forward on projects. And finally, the Planet P. We also know that the projects, when we talk about impact, we've had disparate impacts in underserved communities, and figuring out how to have performance measures around the environmental impacts in disparate communities is also something that's key as well. Next slide. Next slide. So in our department, we have a strategic plan that we adopted in February of this year. We also have a long-range plan that we've recently adopted, and also 5 priorities that we focus on every single day. And we've put some metrics around these 5 priorities that you see here. And some of these are very much related to the 7 national goals, but we didn't create these based on those goals. But safety, clearly, modality, we need to be more innovative. We need to be more efficient. Speaking of project delivery, part of the 7 goals, and again, partnerships. How do we do our work more closely with the people we serve in the state? Next slide. So speaking of safety, Stephanie laid out very well there some of the safety goals that we have. I think there's a lag here, and the next slide. I'll just keep talking. So from a safety standpoint, one of the things that we need to do is clearly address more closely the vulnerable users of the system. We need to have a more targeted focus here. When you look at the data that's recently come out post the pandemic, as we come out of the pandemic, I mean, you clearly see that pedestrians in particular are seeing increasing numbers in serious injuries and fatalities. In California specifically, the trips that are bicycle and pedestrian related are roughly 16%, but the fatalities in the state for vulnerable users are 27%. So clearly there's more work to be done here to hone in specifically on the creating performance measures and targets for not just vehicular movement, but people sort of centric movement. It's going to be, so when it comes to climate action, California, more than any other state, faces a significant challenge with the transportation sector's connection to GHG, to climate, the need to address climate challenges. In California, it's roughly 41% of the GHG emissions in the state. The national number, I believe, is roughly 28 or 29%, so less than a third of GHG nationally comes from the transportation sector. Even though this number on the screen says 41%, in California, this number is actually closer to 50%. When you account for oil production in the state, and the fact that the oil production is related to the transportation sector, that number actually climbs a little bit higher. So again, I know this is already part of the existing TPM that we have, but there are many states that have issues here. Again, California unfortunately leads the way here. I think a lot of attention is being paid to the fact that we're all looking at electrifying the fleet. The fleets across our respective states. Governor Newsom, my boss here, has led the way on this again. He put out an executive order last year during Climate Week that outlined the fact that by the year 2035, roughly 14 years from now, every single new car and truck sold in the state needs to be an electric or ZEV vehicle, zero emission vehicle. Even though that's the case, we know we need to focus on land use. We need to focus on better, improved mobility as well, and not just the fact that we're going to increasingly electrify the fleet across our states. I think, again, increasing our focus on multimodalism is going to be key. We're doing that in California. We're putting more metrics and performance measures around this and all the other key assets that we have developed performance measures for. But moving forward, the Acting Administrator Pollack mentioned the fact that we need to go to the next level. This is one of the areas where next level we need to focus. We know the impacts on public health, the environment, and just access and mobility in general to jobs, to play, et cetera. This is going to be very important. Next slide. Innovation, big thing to keep in mind here is the fact that we have the connected and autonomous technology that is still moving forward. California has led the way in this as well since the early 1990s. A lot of the testing beds for connected and autonomous vehicles or automated vehicles has been in California. We need to continue to keep in mind that this is coming, and what that's going to do to the congestion measures that we've put in place, and how to incorporate the innovation and the technology that's happening around us, how to make sure that we're keeping track of that as well in the measures moving forward. Next slide. On the mobility front or multimodalism front, one of the things we're looking at is contactless pay and how that can help improve transit access and micro-mobility access. Again, something else to keep in mind. There are over 300 transit agencies in California, and these micro-mobility tools or modes that we have, they're all not using the same form of pay system. We're looking to integrate that in California to make mobility choices more seamless. And so we need to keep this in mind as well from a technology standpoint, how we can start to measure improvements in this area as well. Next slide. It's almost 60 years ago to the day, May 9th of 1961. President Kennedy gave an address to Congress, and in this address, he was referencing the fact that his predecessor, General Eisenhower, started the nation down a path of building this great interstate system that we have, that we now know some of the impacts haven't necessarily been the best impacts. But I'll read this very quickly and keep in mind how this relates to this very conversation that we're having about that next level on transportation performance measures. Nothing is more dramatically apparent than the inadequacy of transportation in our larger urban areas. The solution cannot be found only in the construction of additional urban highways. Vital as that job is, he's saying, look, we need to build highways. It's a vital job, but other means of mass transportation, which use less space and equipment, must be improved and expanded. Mass transportation. Perhaps even more important, planning for transportation and land use must go hand in hand as two inseparable aspects of the same process. Lot there, but this was 60 years ago, very much relevant to the discussion we're still having today. Now, it's good that we're thinking about the assets that we've built, this invaluable assets that we've created, building immense bridges and a great highway structure and a system across the country. But let's not forget other key things we need to keep in mind. Transit, how that uses less space and equipment. Planning for transportation and land use. Thinking about those two things helps ultimately the system overall. They go hand in hand as two inseparable aspects of the same process. Very visionary president 60 years ago this month. We need to keep that in mind as we go to the next level on TPM. I know that was a lot, but thank you. And I'm not sure exactly who's next from my peers, but if you could pop on and then I'll jump off. Huyan, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Director Mishakin. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Sean Wilson from the Louisiana DOTD. Dr. Wilson was appointed Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development by Governor John Bell Edwards in January of 2016 and is now serving as Secretary for a second term. He has more than 15 years of executive service at DOTD. Under his leadership thus far, DOTD has ushered in project finance and project innovations, including public-private partnerships and construction management at-risk projects. Since becoming Secretary, DOTD has awarded more than $3.8 billion in construction. Dr. Wilson is a member of the Transportation Research Board Executive Committee and is Vice President of AASHTO. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Wilson.
So thank you for the introduction, Hayana, and for the purposes of saving time, and I know my wonderful fellow secretaries want to share, I will just echo all of the thanks and appreciations that my friend Tokes shared with you, and I will jump right into the presentation because we're alphabetical and Louisiana comes before Minnesota and the state of Washington. So, you know, we in Louisiana look at asset management and performance management as a way to ensure our investment and policy decisions are informed by systems data and are performance driven. This is done by putting our transportation asset management plan into action by investing our capital and operating dollars into programs that support TSM and operations by relying on the state's emergency management plan, our systems management operations, and of course, asset management. Under each of these three items, I will tell you the one that is most evolving for us is climate change, and we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of what we're seeing. Under transportation systems management, operations management, the environmental aspects of what we do, and then emergency management, our extreme weather situations, proposes to give us some real challenges when it comes to performance management. You know, Louisiana was one of the first states to adopt a transportation asset management plan as a part of a pilot program to serve as a guide for other states, and that happened in 2015. We updated it in 2019 with things that we've learned. And then our next update is going to come in 2023, where we're going to incorporate climate change and resiliency, something that we had not anticipated when we first started the asset management plan. And then also under this process, there's a state-based effort under the Climate Change Task Force that the governor created. And that's important for us because in a fossil fuel state, this is the first time in my career and history here that we've had such a robust conversation about what that looks like and how best to manage those situations. So let's talk a little bit about our transportation systems management. You know, our incident management system is something that has really grown and increased in terms of its demand for the public as well as its utility by elected officials and others. And it's a very practical way for individuals to see the value of what we do and how we perhaps use data. Our advanced notification, our 511 system, dynamic message signs are all cherished items, I think, on our system that have grown to be much more important and much more significant for the users of our system. And that alone gives me some really good feelings around the value that we offer. Something as simple as our motor assistance patrol trucks, probably the most popular thing that we do. I think it actually rivals overlays and new bridge work because it's visible, it's obvious, and it's when people are most in need. And that, to me, is what transportation systems are supposed to be about. Very consistent with what Administrator Pollack shared with you around the safety features of what we're doing. You know, we do not have the best safety numbers here in the state, and we're one of those 30 states that did not meet their goal, but we are committed to constantly evolving and changing what it is we do in terms of ensuring our travelers are safe and our employees are safe. Everything from changing laws, which we're doing right now in terms of creating a safety corridor, to actually doing equipment options and providing other changes on our regime of our lights and our striping and other aspects of what we do in addition to the engineering. These are things that are around the corners of the project and maybe around the edges of what we do, but they're significant in terms of its impact. Under the world of ITS, you know, we've talked about communication and the value of what that is. You know, for a Department of Transportation that is typically not going to be actively out there communicating most effectively, we've learned the value of social media, the value of messaging, and the value of communication. Likewise, signal synchronization, taking advantage of technology to move people more effectively, more efficiently, and creating those options. Here in Louisiana, we've got a couple of things that I think speak to better performance management for us around our work zone management, our ferry boat systems and how we're communicating and being more efficient and how we're holding ourselves accountable, as well as how we respond to complaints. That's something that oftentimes has gone unnoticed for citizens here, but when it starts at the executive in terms of me being able to respond to those issues or questions that folks may have, it's important for them to understand that we hear them and that we're engaged with them, not just in terms of the final product, but how we get there, to keep them informed around what we're doing and how we're managing our system. You know, emergency management is something that I've learned in my 6 years as secretary. It is probably one of the most critical aspects of my job. Because it's going to determine success or failure, as well as life and safety for employees, as well as citizens. We're well versed in emergency management, not because we really like to, but because we have no choice, and we've had quite a few of them. In fact, we're in the middle of one of those as we speak today. So our State Emergency Operations Center is up and running, and it is probably one of the saving graces in terms of ensuring that there aren't any other catastrophic failures. Looking at how we've activated our response to events, we look at hurricanes, whether it's flooding, snow and ice, hazardous materials. All of these things are happening just within the last 6 months in terms of what we've had to deal with. And I've coined a phrase here that we've talked about at resilience conferences, that things are wetter, wilder, and weirder in terms of what we're experiencing and what we're seeing. As a result, I'm not sure that we as a state have really done as much of a good job as we can. And I actually spoke about this today with our legislative auditor around a performance audit that's underway. We've not really quantified that for the general public in a way that makes good sense. And so incorporating performance management in this very difficult and diverse environment of emergency response, I think is going to be very impressive for the public and communicates the need and the value of transportation. We serve as the lead support function agency for transportation and emergency support, as well as public works and engineering, all building blocks of safety, recovery, response, all essential to what's happening. And when we talk about these disasters, whether they're 3 million cubic yards of debris that's picked up, these are images from Lake Charles, Louisiana, that was damaged and hurt severely in Hurricanes Laura and Delta last hurricane season. Just 2 weeks ago, we completed our debris missions in the state of Louisiana, and we're approximately 1 month away from the next hurricane season. In between these hurricanes, we had unprecedented ice storms in Louisiana where we were below freezing, 1 or 2 days without any real sun, just complete overcast, where we had over 1 inch of ice on bridges. Why is that a challenge for us in Louisiana? Well, we've got the 4th largest bridge deck area in the country, 10 of the top 10 longest bridges typically over water. And so this was a very common scene this past winter across Louisiana. We've actually exercised some strategic closures so that we can better use our resources, both human resources, materials, and life-saving measures, such that in that freeze disaster, we had 0 deaths related to the conditions on our road. Now, that is in contrast to the number of people that are unfortunately killed or hurt or injured and involved in crashes and collisions on our system on a normal basis. So at these peak times, we've seemed to have done a much better job at how we manage ourselves and manage our resources. And just yesterday, these are images. The scene on the right is one of the scenes at an underpass here in Louisiana, where yesterday we lost 4 citizens to this rain event with 12 to 15 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. 3 of them were drownings in vehicles. The other was a result of a utility outage where they had life support services. So clearly, we can see how crisis management and incident management in these circumstances will ultimately affect performance management, regardless of how we measure it and how often we measure it, because this is going to be front of mind for families and citizens for some time to come. So how do we manage that overall? Well, clearly recognizing that I can't control the emergency responses or the disasters rather that we are faced and only deal with it from a response standpoint, we look at our capital budget and our operating budgets as ways to make performance management real for Louisiana. Our budget petition is divided into 5 categories: system preservation, which is primarily asset management; operations, motorist services; transportation systems management; and operations. Operations includes our district forces, which contribute to the bulk of the effort in emergency management before, during, and after an event. This also happens to be the place where the vast majority of the work on our system occurs. And so our operations piece is absolutely essential. And the general public oftentimes wonder why we fight so hard to make these investments in operations and protect them. And systematically, when this fails, the services of the department will absolutely fail, because this is the human resource. This is the muscle of the department. They're called upon to make regular routine maintenance activities real. Everything from cutting grass, mowing cycles, guardrail repairs, cable barriers repairs, signal head repairs, a number of items that are just routine things that we tend to not cut ribbons on and celebrate. And as a result, they don't get the political attention that I think that they deserve from our elected officials to say that's of real value to citizens. That budget petition here is the composite of it makes our total construction budget. And this is important to note simply because citizens don't always understand government. They just look for a magic wand to be waved and to deliver it. But we're very thoughtful on what we spend, how we spend it, and the outcomes that it should have. And so each of these, this is an example of how we spend our dollars on system and off system. And look, these numbers are very small, but I will remind you that we're a small state, only about 4.5 million people, predominantly a rural area. And we spend a lot of our money on our system preservations and our bridge work, both on and off system, because those are so critical to mobility. And at the end of the day, that is what really matters here. We'd love to jump into the world of transit like some of the folks that you're going to hear about from today. The reality is, without the financial resources, no matter how much performance management we have, the challenge is the more I invest in other services, the less I invest in the capital expenditures and the things that comprise our budget. These are the things that give us real big bang, whether it's ITS, and we talked a little bit about this a minute ago, traffic control devices. How do we deal with roadway flooding? I think performance management in this world of disasters and resilience will help justify more funding for more than $3.7 million when we have the type of images that we saw yesterday, and we have the type of frequency and the violent weather conditions that we're having. In 2016, we had a 500-year flood and a 1,000-year flood 3 months apart. As a result, we increased our budget threefold in terms of what we're doing on statewide flood control. It's just a drop in the bucket. It will not create a ripple in the bucket considering the level of needs. But all of these are things that add value, but are the things that we're finding ourselves having to place the bare minimum because of the lack of resources. And as a result, our performance measures perhaps will ultimately show what that disinvestment is. And so, Hayana, that's a quick overview of how we're operating in Louisiana. We see this as tremendously valuable to us in terms of how we present our system and manage what we do. And we look forward to having any questions that you may have. And I hope I was able to save some time for Margaret and Roger.
Thanks, Sean. All right. And next, we have a recorded presentation from Margaret Anderson Kelleher. Margaret Anderson Kelleher was appointed Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Transportation on December 18, 2018 by Minnesota Governor-elect Tim Walz. She began her job on January 2nd of 2019 when the Walz-Flanagan administration took office. She served 12 years in the Minnesota House of Representatives, where she was elected as the Minnesota House Speaker for 4 years. While in the Minnesota House, she served 10 years on both the Transportation Policy and Transportation Finance Committees. Since 2011, she's been the president of the Minnesota High-Tech Association. While serving as House Speaker, Kelleher oversaw the successful transportation and transit funding package, creating an investment of new and dedicated funds into Minnesota's bridges, roads, and transit system. At the time of passage, the legislation was a groundbreaking investment in the multimodal transportation and transit system in Minnesota and nationally. And now let's hear from Commissioner Anderson Kelleher.
It's great to be with you today. Thanks for inviting me to present. Minnesota, like many of your transportation systems, has many users and many uses. Like other states, our system is a complex system with the interplay of roads, bridges, sidewalks, bikeways, airports, rail, waterways, and more. So measuring performance can really help us understand more about if our system is meeting the goals that we have set for it. At the same time, every single thing we do involves trade-offs that include the cost-benefit analysis, the short-term versus the long-term, and many, many more trade-offs. Our performance data really helps us make decisions wisely, and those decisions also rely on us to consider the needs of our users and sometimes the changing needs of our users as well. This is something that historically we haven't always had as a piece of transportation systems. Certainly early on in road building, it was not something that people thought about. In addition to our traditional measures of system performance and safety, it's really to Minnesota essential to consider who we serve, the people who we have served, and historically who have been underserved by our transportation system, and how transportation can really contribute to remedies for global threats that we face, things like climate change, and what we can do to ensure that transportation is actually better serving communities. Today, I'm going to share how MnDOT is making strides in performance metrics in the areas of equity, accessibility, or access to important destinations, why we do this work, getting people to and from the places they need to go, and sustainability as demonstration of the sophistication of the work that we reflect on the needs, uses, and impacts to a very strong transportation system. We're going to start in talking about measuring transportation equity. And in our thinking about transportation equity, we're going to start with a few things that we know. And they include that the 1950s and 1960s in transportation planning led to some very serious inequities for BIPOC communities in Minnesota and around the country. Particularly in Minnesota, Black communities as well as Indigenous people were really displaced at times and also experienced business closure and wealth erosion. On top of that, it mostly took place in communities where loans were denied or housing was restricted because of deeds that had restricted covenants on them, which led to lower property values. Suburban sprawl also further increased segregation in our communities and income inequality. And our previous engagement process made it difficult for everyone to participate due to things like language barriers and lack of information in the communities that were affected. We also know and make it our general transportation goal that transportation supports the health of people, environment, and the economy. We know that transportation equity also should be ensuring that transportation spending services and systems are fair and equitable to people, especially Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who really are empowered more in transportation decision-making than they once were. We are currently in the process of both developing quantitative and qualitative measures related to transportation equity through a research project with Texas A&M's Transportation Institute. The project includes developing new measures, but also examining our current measures to see how they might be modified or adjusted to better account for equity. What we know is that we need to be able to really disaggregate data to see and understand how the distribution of benefits and the burdens of transportation are shared or not shared. Minnesota has really been a state that has had high marks on our statewide measures, but we also come from a place that has some of the highest and worst disparities between white people and people of color. We can only see and understand more deeply what is happening when we disaggregate this data. Our data and methods also have biases and assumptions built right in them. It's true of any time you're working with models, that the model is going to have the makers of the model's perspectives embedded into it. So we are embarking to really interrogate that data model and understand where those biases and assumptions are and help understand them. Understanding the qualitative experience of people is also critical for us to be able to evaluate and advance equity. We really cannot solely be able to think about the quantitative measures. As an industry, we have to grapple with stories, the lived experiences, and be able to put those together with the data that we're seeing. As you can tell by this slide alone, that measuring transportation equity is going to be a multidimensional piece of work that we all need to be doing together. We also are focusing on new walking performance measures. And we know the importance and benefits of safe pedestrian networks to individual communities. For example, here in Minnesota, our Indigenous communities, we have 11 federally recognized tribal communities, are largely in the rural part of our state. And we also know that Indigenous people walk more than others to get from place to place, to visit relatives, to go to critical services like health and community services. We've just finished our first statewide pedestrian plan. And as part of that plan, we set a number of new performance measures and targets, including measuring the share of people who primarily walk to work with a goal of doubling that rate in each of our 8 MnDOT districts. The percentage of people who walk for transportation at least a few times a week, currently about a third of Minnesotans report walking at least a few times a week. Our target is to get that up to 60% for both health and climate goals. And we've identified a number of gaps in our existing sidewalk network, and we want to eliminate all of those gaps. This is just more, it's more than just the ADA compliance. It's about ensuring that there's complete networks and doing the right thing for all people that we serve. The plan also is establishing guidance for preferred facilities based on land use context, which is critical. Being able to put together land use and transportation is really going to help us be able to put those preferred walking facilities that may look different in an urban commercial district from a rural area. This is, I think, a big step forward. We also are measuring climate impacts in Minnesota, and you can see here on this slide that Minnesota has been impacted by climate events. We already have been looking at what types of climate impacts we are seeing, everything from the top 3, flooding, warmer winters, and invasive species. And those things all are in the very high to high category of impact. And then you can see down below, you know, we have a little less impact of wildfires and severe wind. Those are lower impacts for us. But as we're looking at these impacts of climate change, primarily through those first big 3, warmer winters, heavier rain events, and also seeing invasive species, Minnesota is really going to be one of the states heavily affected by climate change. Just a few things that we are seeing going forward that we're really looking to tackle, and that is that these impacts are being felt disproportionately by BIPOC and low-income communities, and they have a direct effect on both health and culture. For example, the National Climate Assessment identified risks to tribal nations from the future loss of wild rice habitat that is directly connected to the culture and economy of tribal nations within the state. We're also working to improve our data on climate risk and vulnerability and addressing future changes in terms of risk and likelihood and magnitude of impacts to prioritize the efforts and investments that we're making. While there remains a lot of uncertainty about specific changes, there's very clear understanding that these risks will increase over time, and we need to work now to begin to better understand and prepare. The specific working efforts include working with other state agencies and university partners to be able to gather local data on climate risk and vulnerability, developing cross-disciplinary teams to improve our guidance and policies related to climate resilience, leveraging internal expertise and understanding on climate impacts, including hard data and qualitative experience from maintenance staff, funding research on climate impacts, including pavement performance impacts with the increased freeze-thaw cycle that we face, and developing measures to better track and support progress towards resilience goals. While state DOTs have been working together to share best practices and information, there remains ample opportunity to do even more in this area. And we've been encouraged by early conversations with the Biden administration as well to support DOTs in this area through guidance, direction, research, and funding. One particular thing that we have that we're very proud of and have done a lot of work with is that we have built in Minnesota upon the 2007 bipartisan Next Generation Energy Act. That act actually created reducing greenhouse gas emissions for the economy as widely as we could see in Minnesota by 2015, 2025, and 2050. The good story out of that is the energy sector, who was really the first one to take this on, did a very good job in Minnesota. But the state actually missed its first 15% reduction in 2015 and is not on track to meet the future goals, 2025, which was a 30% reduction to be, and 2050, 80% reduction. In this work, 2005 is the baseline year. So in being able to really examine why are we missing, what we saw is that transportation is really the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And while transportation emissions decreased by about 7% from the 2005 baseline, little progress has really been made over the last 10 years. So MnDOT is specifically directed by state statute to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. And in 2017, we adopted a state goal for transportation. And in 2019, we led the interagency work on pathways to decarbonizing transportation as both a project and a report that you can see here on the slide. This was meant to identify strategies and actions that could make progress towards a low carbon transportation system of the future. One recommendation from that Pathways project was to continue engagement with the public, private, and nonprofit sectors and community groups. And we did that by creating a governor's appointed Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council, or STAC. This is a long form public engagement process. It has everyone from private sector folks to community-based organizations, city and local governments represented, elected officials, as well as environmental justice advocates. And through all of the work, we are both looking at both climate and environmental justice. The STAC recently provided recommendations to MnDOT to be able to really, what are things that we can do together to reduce greenhouse gases in Minnesota. So I'm gonna dive into that just a little bit more deeply in our next slide. And so the top policy recommendations came out of two committees at this point. One is a Fueling Empowering Transportation group, and the other is a Vehicle Miles Traveled Reduction and Transportation Options group. And so you can see here that the three top priorities that came out of each of these groups. I think most notably, the Fueling Empowering Transportation group really pointed to us that Minnesota as a state needs to increase its infrastructure for fueling and powering. We also need to develop a clean fuels policy. And right now we're going through the process of having MnDOT lead that work for the enterprise. And then also making sure that there are incentives for electric vehicles, including dealership support and consumer rebates that are available in that area. In the vehicle miles traveled area, probably the most notable recommendation is to adopt a statewide goal of reducing the vehicle miles traveled by 20% by 2050. And we have accepted this as MnDOT with a sort of preliminary goal. We need to do more public engagement around it. We have seen an embrace of this goal by the legislature as well. And it's unclear if the legislature is going to enact that this year. We are going into an overtime session here, special session. But it has been an important piece to kind of get feedback already from our stakeholders in the legislature, who overall have been positive about this. Also stopping expanding highway capacity for congestion purposes, and the other one is to prioritize transit, which I think is a key piece. I'm going to go on to sustainability reporting and share with you that we actually created our first annual sustainability report in 2016 that established a set of sustainability performance measures related to the transportation sector. And this has been an important benchmark for us as we've been moving forward. The report has been evolving since 2016. And in 2020, the version, which will be released next month, will include 30 performance measures to track, report, and encourage progress towards goals established by statute, executive order, and agency direction on sustainability. 2020 is also the first year that the report adds specific performance measures around public health and climate resilience. Since we started working on climate action in earnest, we've heard from Minnesotans across the state that climate change and mitigating climate change is a priority issue, and that they see MnDOT as a leader in the transportation sector, and they expect MnDOT to lead on this issue. So the expectations are certainly not easy to meet in this area, but we view them as a critical opportunity, especially as we focus on solutions with co-benefits. And some of those include promoting electric vehicle and renewable energy can help bring new and private investment and jobs to the state while saving the agency money for operations. Reducing carbon pollution in pavements can mean longer term fixes and improve performance and reduce costs. Creating more walkable and bikeable communities can improve public health, improve public safety, and reduce past and future inequalities. And leading on climate can help us also critically attract and retain talent as well. Closely related to the work on vehicle miles traveled is equity, and MnDOT has been interested in equity and accessibility for a long time. In fact, MnDOT has funded research out of the University of Minnesota since the early 2000s that looks at accessibility measures. We now are the lead agency for the National Accessibility Evaluation Pooled Fund Project. And accessibility really gets to the purpose of transportation, to connect people to important destinations. And accessibility makes our suite of measures more complete compared to our transportation only focused metrics. So what is accessibility, you might be wondering today? Well, we say accessibility measures the ease of reaching the valued destination. Accessibility is also about opportunities. For example, we can reach 100,000 jobs in 30 minutes. But because transportation exists to connect people to their destinations that matter in their lives, accessibility provides the context and for existing performance measure. And it also reflects both transportation and land use, which I already mentioned once before, that development can increase congestion, or it could also help us improve accessibility. But we want to make sure that transportation investments can improve accessibility and encourage development and have it happen in a way that's meaningful for folks. Questions that we often have to ask in this area: is access low or high in regard to equity? How is access distributed across the population? And MnDOT reports on accessibility in our performance dashboard already. We've started to work with access to jobs by auto and transit maps, and we're now including those more descriptive infographics like the ones that you can see here. This infographic uses the University of Minnesota's pooled fund data, and it shows accessibility by bicycle in this particular example. Another area where accessibility is important in the work that MnDOT's doing is on a project called Rethinking I-94, which is the project that's looking at the connection of Interstate 94 between our two cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. We contracted with the U of M to do an analysis and look at the accessibility impacts for transit and automobiles and look at a major managed lane project on the corridor. As we've been working through this, we have seen that this particular corridor really has a number of levels of how we might address accessibility going forward. MnDOT itself has been a proponent at the national level, including through AASHTO's Committee on Performance-Based Management. And MnDOT has submitted a NCHRP report project proposal that's currently underway called Accessibility Measures in Practice, to help establish standard practices around accessibility measures. MnDOT has wrapped up a pilot study, and the goal was there to test available platforms and to serve as a proof of concept at a project level and do the analysis to demonstrate how the accessibility analysis can be implemented in decision making. We have also analyzed accessibility on 2 transportation projects and as a land use example for a potential site in our rural area in Minnesota. MnDOT staff is learning how to use the Conveil tool, which we can now we can use and be able to project analysis and do the analysis of the alternatives in-house. We feel that project analysis in-house is a good next frontier for us to be going into as we look forward to for the potential of estimating the impacts of transportation investments on travel behavior and emissions, and identify ways to assess plans and projects for their future effects, lowering VMT and greenhouse gases. And finally, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to present information on MnDOT's forward look on performance measures. For more information about our transportation performance measures, we have a great performance dashboard dedicated to telling the sophisticated and nuanced story of our transportation system. I invite you to access that dashboard and our performance scorecard at performance.minnesotago, all one word, .org. Thanks so much for joining me for the presentation today.